So guys, in this video I'll be going over the December 2025 Gear Lab update, featuring the Rainbow G7E and a gold skip bomber. Starting with the Rainbow G7E, quite frankly I've been checked out from submarine stuff for a while now, so I'm not going to be giving the most in-depth analysis of this thing, and while its strengths are quite obvious for the most part, there are a lot of nuances when it comes to submarine equipment, around the cooldowns of submarine torpedoes, and how long each individual submarine stays in battle. First of all, compared to the other Rainbow submarine torpedo, the Type 95 Kai, since that one doesn't have any homing capability, and the G7E has the best homing out of all submarine torpedoes, with their damage being quite close as well, the G7E should be better in all cases where the boss isn't just standing still for the entire duration of the torpedoes being fired. The G7E fires the same 2 torpedoes per round and has slightly lower cooldown, meaning that for any submarine, they will always fire at least as many torpedoes with the G7E or more compared to the Type 97 Kai. Unfortunately, the Rainbow G7E has 25 less range than the Type 95 Kai, and even using the pressure hull auxiliary, your submarine will only move forward by 8 more units, which is far from being able to have the same range as the Type 95 Kai, so in cases where the enemy hangs very far back, the G7E might just not be able to lock onto them altogether. So this is something else that is also worth considering. And it's not only in cases where the boss is always out of range where the Type 95 might be better. They could also just move out of the range of the G7E for perhaps 30% of its potential uptime, which would reduce the amount of torpedoes it fires by 30%, making the Type 95 better despite the lack of tracking. I think if you haven't crafted any Rainbow submarine torpedoes, then the G7E would be the safer bet because of its tracking as well as lower cooldown, but if you've crafted some Type 95s, it's also not the end of the world because they're still going to be better in some situations. Now, there is another competitor, the red-tipped bitters, which is another homing torpedo with slightly worse tracking than the G7E and lower damage per torpedo, both in base damage and worse armor modifiers. The main selling point of the bitter is that it fires 3 torpedoes instead of 2 per round, like the G7E and Type 95 Kai. This means that 2 rounds of the bitters will fire 6 torpedoes, whereas it would take 3 rounds of G7E to fire the same 6 torpedoes. Submarines enter the battle ready to fire, so it would take a submarine 21.81 seconds to get 2 rounds of bitters, if we just look at the base cooldown for now, whereas 3 rounds of G7E would take 13.8 times 2, which is 27.6 seconds to fire the same number of torpedoes, which is quite a lot more time. These aren't exact figures of what actually happens in battle, because submarine torpedoes have volley time that has to be added to their cooldowns, and all submarines have multiple torpedo slots too, which push back each other's cooldowns. The number of rounds that these submarines can fire will depend on how long they stay in battle, which is a function of their oxygen stat, plus additional skill effects that increase their oxygen or staying time, plus their reload stat, which dictates what the actual cooldown of the torpedoes are on the ship. If I was a bit more invested, I would be able to tell you which subs would be able to fire more torpedoes with bitter compared to G7E, and which would fire the same amount, and then be able to make a recommendation based on that. But for now, all I would say is that the only Rainbow submarine, I-404, stays around much longer than the average submarine, and should have enough oxygen to fire about the same number of torpedoes for both G7E and the bitters, making the G7E better for her. For other submarines, I would recommend taking whichever submarine of yours that you're curious about, putting them into your challenge mode fleet with your best submarine cats, and then going into battle and counting the number of torpedoes they fire with each torp. Make sure to give them a pressure hull so that they'll stay in range as much as possible, as you should only be trying to test the reload in this experiment, since different bosses have different movement patterns, so whether or not the torpedo is in range will differ from battle to battle. This method will sort out any kind of differences in reload as well as between Oath submarines and different Maleficers with different amounts of reload stat. Do know that the Maleficers give even more oxygen in Operation Siren though compared to anywhere else. In my estimation, there are going to be a lot of submarines that perform as well with the bitters, or better than the G7E, and given the much steeper investment of the G7E, I don't think it's something that progressing players need to worry about. However, torpedoes along with anti-air materials will start piling up long before the other equipment parts, at which point there's nothing wrong with crafting a few of these Rainbow Torps. That's kind of the logic I went with when I crafted the Type 95 Kai as well. Anyway, these three are the only three relevant submarine torpedoes as of now, so I guess this kind of turned into a mini submarine torpedo guide. I hope everything has made sense so far. Next up is the skip bomber, and for this one, if you don't understand my explanation that I'm about to give, I really recommend watching my in-depth dive bomber and torpedo bomber guide, which will provide all the context you need. So this dive bomber actually functions more similar to an aimed torpedo bomber, and since it drops 2 bombs, the obvious comparison is to Saiyan. Unfortunately, it retains the lower aviation scaling that dive bombers have compared to other plane types, probably as compensation for their larger AoE, so it's fighting an uphill battle. Looking over to the Saiyan, even if we don't adjust for its lower aviation scaling, we can see that the Saiyan's bombs are both stronger, and the cooldown of the plane is much lower than the Su-6 skip bomber. And if you want to purposely slow down your airstrikes, then you also have the slow as balls option of the VIT-2 up here, which is almost as slow but deals much more damage. If you scale these damage numbers down by 0.8, then the comparison is even more bleak. Therefore, in terms of flex slots like Amagi's second slot for example, the Su-6 will not be competing with torpedo bombers at all for the purpose of nuking a single boss, unless for some reason the VIT-2 is still not slow enough and that 0.2 seconds of base cooldown actually makes a difference. Also, against a fight like Azur meta, with a bunch of enemies grouped up, maybe its 8 splash compared to just 3 of a normal torpedo bomber might make a difference, but I'm skeptical. This is not the end of the story for the Su-6 though, because there are slots like Hakuryu's second slot, where you must run a dive bomber, so let's take a look to see if the Su-6 is worth using over traditional dive bombers after adjusting for their hit rate. Looking at this comparison, the Su-6 actually beats out every dive bomber on average on a per strike basis except for the Tenrai, including the SB2C and SB3C, which were the previous stepping stones before obtaining Tenrai, so it definitely has its place as the new best dive bomber for single target use before getting the Tenrai. Compared to the Tenrai, it does deal lower damage on average and has 20 less aviation, but it still serves the purpose of being more consistent and just a smidge faster, which may come into play occasionally. Still, I suppose it's good balancing that a gold plane doesn't outright replace a rainbow plane, but if they end up releasing a rainbow skip bomber that is still kneecapped by the 80% aviation scaling compared to other plane types, that would be expected, but also pretty sad. Next up, there's also this new light cruiser gun, which is a weaker version of the one you can get from PR8, which is already very weak. Compared to the PR8 one, it has lower base damage, longer cooldown, and worse armor mods. I don't remember if there was like a light cruiser that doubles their gun damage, if their gun is 180mm or bigger or something, but yeah, it's completely irrelevant, being the weaker version of an already irrelevant gun. Okay, that's pretty much it for the new stuff from this Gear Lab update. There's also the old stuff that was added to the Gear Lab, PR5 stuff, and Russian equipment. I covered all of them in detail in my in-depth equipment guides, so check those out if you want my opinions on equipment like the Tashkent gun or the Plymouth gun. With that being said, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.